a tree, and the whole village laughed at him. But when the harshest freeze in decades hit, they all ran to him for Spacini. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. He had never believed in the idea of home as something permanent. For most of his adult life, a house had been little more than a roof that delayed the inevitable, a thin barrier between his body and the slow violence of the seasons. He moved from one crumbling structure to another, always at the margins of towns that were themselves sliding quietly into extinction. These were places that did not appear on any tourist map, where the paint on the porches had long ago surrendered to rot, where the yards were measured not in flowers, but in rusted appliances and forgotten lumber. He learned early that poverty was not loud. It did not announce itself with drama. It worked patiently, dissolving walls from the inside, teaching a man to accept things that should never be acceptable. The last house he rented had looked solid enough when he first stepped inside. The floors were uneven, the windows old, but it had a stove, a roof that did not yet leak, and a small shed behind it where he could stack firewood. It was autumn then, the air already sharp in the mornings, but the sunlight still carried warmth. He told himself that with enough discipline he could make it through the winter. He sealed the obvious cracks with strips of cloth and expanding foam he had scavenged from a closed hardware store, covered the windows with plastic sheets, and spent every spare dollar on firewood. By November, he was already burning more than he had planned. The house drank heat as if it were thirsty. He began to notice how the cold did not merely come from the outside. It crept upward from the floorboards, seeping through the soles of his boots and into his bones. Even when the stove glowed orange and the air above his head felt warm, his feet remained numb, as though they were standing on ice. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that winter always felt worse in its early weeks, that the body would adjust. But the smell of damp wood grew stronger, and dark stains bloomed at the base of the walls. The ground beneath the house was changing, hardening into something that no longer yielded. By December, the first hairline cracks appeared along the corners of the rooms. At first, they were thin as threads, barely visible unless he crouched close to the plaster. He ran his fingers over them, feeling how the surface crumbled at the slightest pressure. Each morning he found new lines where none had been the night before. Doors began to stick, then to hang crooked in their frames. When he walked across the kitchen, the floorboards no longer responded with the dull creak he was used to. They answered with a hollow echo, as if the house were emptying itself from below. The night, it finally became clear that he was losing. The battle came without ceremony. The temperature outside had dropped so suddenly that even the radio announcer seemed surprised by it. He fed the stove until the metal was almost white with heat and lay down fully dressed, telling himself that he would get up to add more wood when the fire died down. He woke hours later to a sound he could not immediately identify, a dry, splintering noise that echoed through the structure. At first, he thought it was the wind tearing at the roof, but when he placed his hand on the wall, he felt a faint vibration moving upward, as though something beneath the house were shifting in its sleep. He lit his flashlight and walked through the rooms. In the corner of the living area, a crack had opened wide enough to admit the tip of his finger. Cold air flowed through it in a steady stream, carrying with it the sharp smell of frozen soil. In the kitchen, the legs of the table leaned at a new angle, as if someone had shortened one of them. The back door refused to close, no matter how hard he pushed. When he stepped into the small storage room where he kept his boxes, he found water pooled on the floor, already skinning over with a thin layer of ice. The ground was pulling the house down with it, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the following days, the damage accelerated. The stove no longer managed to hold the temperature for more than a few minutes. Heat vanished into the floor as though swallowed by a mouth that could never be filled. Mold spread in gray patches along the lower parts of the walls, feeding on the dampness that rose from below. The smell was everywhere, in his clothes, in his hair, in the paper of the books he had saved from earlier moves. He watched photographs curl and discolor inside their frames, watched cardboard boxes soften and collapse. When he lifted one to salvage what he could, the bottom fell out in his hands. The inspector who came to assess the building did not need much time. He knelt, pressed a metal rod into the earth beside the foundation, and listened to the hollow sound it made. The frost had penetrated deep, weakening the ground and pushing the supports out of alignment. The verdict was written in neutral language, but the meaning was simple. The house was no longer safe to inhabit. Repairs would cost more than the structure was worth. He was advised to vacate immediately. He left with what he could carry, stuffing clothes into bags, wrapping documents in plastic, salvaging a few tools that had not yet rusted. The rest he abandoned to the slow, grinding process that would eventually reduce the house to a slanted shell. Standing outside in the thin winter light, he felt less grief than exhaustion. This was not the first time he had lost a home, and he suspected it would not be the last. What frightened him was not the loss itself, but the pattern it revealed. No matter how carefully he worked, no matter how many cracks he sealed, the cold always found a way in from below. The ground was not a neutral surface. It was an enemy that waited patiently until a man had nothing left to fight with. He spent the next weeks sleeping in borrowed rooms in the back of his truck, moving between acquaintances who were themselves barely holding on. Everywhere he went, he saw the same signs. Floors that never quite dried, walls that smelled of rot, people who complained that their heaters ran constantly, yet their houses never felt warm. It was as if the earth itself had turned hostile, freezing solid in the winter and bleeding dampness upward in every other season. One night, lying in the cab of his truck with his coat pulled over his head, he realized that he had been asking the wrong question all along. He had been trying to learn how to make houses stronger against the cold, when what he needed was to understand how to escape the cold altogether. The memory of his grandfather came to him then, not as a face or a voice, but as an idea that had waited years to become useful. When he was a child, his grandfather had told him about places in the South where people built their homes on posts, lifting them above the ground to escape water and decay. At the time, it had sounded like an odd tradition, a relic from another world. Now it returned with new clarity. If the earth in this place was what stole the heat, then perhaps the only real solution was to break contact with it entirely. By the time he found the small, neglected plot of land on the edge of a dying village, the decision had already taken root in his mind. He would not try to outsmart the soil again. He would not sink another foundation into frozen ground and pray it would hold. Whatever he built next would stand apart from the earth, removed from the cold that rose invisibly from below. The house that had broken his former life had given him more than a warning. It had taught him where the true battle was being fought, and for the first time he felt that he might be ready to choose a different battlefield. The decision to leave the earth behind did not immediately give him a place to stand. It gave him a direction, nothing more, and direction meant little without money. He spent the first days after abandoning the broken house moving between shelters that were offered out of pity rather than generosity. Each borrowed room carried the scent of someone else's life, someone else's compromises. He woke to unfamiliar ceilings, to heating systems that rattled like old lungs, and every morning the same thought returned with growing insistence. He needed ground of his own, even if it was only a narrow strip of it, because without that there could be no escape from the cycle he had just witnessed. The search for land became an exercise in humility. He scoured notice boards and grocery stores, drove slowly past properties with sagging signs, called numbers that rang unanswered. Anything solid enough to promise security was far beyond his reach. Parcels with proper access, stable soil, nearby services were traded among people who could afford patience. What remained were scraps, forgotten corners that had outlived their usefulness, pieces of the world that no one else wanted to inherit. It was among these that he finally found something he could almost afford. The village lay miles from the nearest town, far enough that the road into it had lost its will to remain smooth. Patches of asphalt had surrendered to gravel, and in winter the snowplows rarely bothered to reach it. Most of the houses were older than the people who still occupied them. Their windows were dim with years of dust, and their yards carried the quiet evidence of abandonment. Collapsed fences, rotting sheds, half-buried appliances that had once been too heavy to move and were now too meaningless to remove. He sensed immediately that this was a place where things ended slowly rather than abruptly, where decay was accepted as a condition of life rather than a problem to be solved. The plot itself was hardly more than a scar in the landscape, a narrow rectangle at the edge of the tree line where a house had once stood before surrendering to time. What remained of that structure was nothing but a low mound of soil, mixed with fragments of brick and splintered beams that stuck up like broken bones. Grass refused to grow there, and the earth had a tired look to it, as though it had been used up by previous ambitions. Yet it was cheap, and more importantly, it was free of neighbors who might care what he did with it. On his first evening there, he walked the boundaries of the land in the fading light. The cold had returned after a brief thaw, and the surface of the ground was already hardening again. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the soil, feeling how the top layer yielded only slightly before turning rigid. This was the enemy he had come to understand, not as a poetic concept but as a physical force. Beneath this crust lay a depth of frozen mass that would continue to steal heat long after the air above had warmed. He imagined a house sitting here, its foundation sunk into this indifferent substance, and he felt the old fatigue rising in him. He refused to repeat the same mistake. The village did not welcome him with open curiosity. People noticed him, of course, noticed the unfamiliar truck parked at the edge of the forest, the solitary figure moving through the ruins of a former home site. But there was no enthusiasm in their attention, only a mild irritation at the presence of someone who did not yet understand the unwritten rule of the place, that nothing truly new was supposed to happen here. They had seen others arrive with plans and leave with nothing, and they had learned to treat intention as a temporary condition. He spent days clearing what little debris remained, stacking old boards into piles that he could later sort through, digging out bits of metal and glass that might tear a tire or a boot. As he worked, he observed the patterns of the land with the patience of someone who had learned to listen to environments rather than impose himself on them. He watched how water collected in shallow depressions even in the cold, how the wind traveled unbroken from the open fields and then slowed abruptly when it met the trees. He took note of which parts of the ground held snow the longest and which shed it quickly, understanding that these details would decide whether he survived the next winter or not. The people of the village began to talk about him in the indirect way of small places. He heard fragments when he went to the only store for bread and coffee. Someone said he was wasting his time. Someone else remarked that the land there had killed a house once and would do it again. No one addressed him directly, but their skepticism hung in the air, a kind of invisible frost. He recognized it from every place he had ever lived. It was easier for them to expect his failure than to imagine a different outcome for themselves. Yet, as the days passed and he continued to prepare the site, he felt a strange calm growing in him. This land, poor as it was, belonged to him in a way no previous home had. There was no landlord to threaten eviction, no contract that could dissolve overnight. Even the hostility of the ground felt honest, a problem that could be studied and countered rather than endured blindly. He began to sketch plans in a battered notebook at night, drawing shapes that had nothing to do with foundations or basements. His lines climbed upward instead of sinking into the page. The more he studied the place, the clearer the threat became. Every house in the village shared the same weakness. They all trusted the earth to support them, to behave as a neutral base when in reality it was the source of their suffering. In summer, it fed moisture into their walls, breeding rot and mold. In winter, it hardened into a mass of ice that pulled heat relentlessly downward. He could see it in the way the villagers walked through their homes with hunched shoulders, in the resigned way they spoke about high heating bills and rooms that never felt warm. They had learned to live with it, but they had not learned to defeat it. He chose his spot at the edge of the plot where the trees grew thickest, a stand of old conifers whose roots ran deep and whose trunks bore the scars of storms that had passed decades earlier. He felt a peculiar respect for them. They had stood through winters far worse than anything he remembered, and they had done so not by fighting the cold directly, but by rising above the worst of it, letting the wind pass through their branches while their bodies remained intact. There was a lesson in that endurance, one he intended to apply to his own fragile construction. As he stood there one evening, with the notebook in his hand, watching the last light slide down the trunks of the trees, he understood that this was not simply about building a place to sleep. It was about redefining what a house meant in a world where the ground itself had become unreliable. The patch of land he had claimed was not a foundation in the traditional sense. It was a boundary, the line he had drawn between the life that had broken him and the one he was determined to invent. The forest at the edge of his land became his classroom. He walked among the trunks every morning before the cold loosened its grip, touching bark that was rough with age and sap, watching how the branches carried the weight of frost without breaking. The village lay behind him, quiet and withdrawn, but here among the trees he felt a different rhythm, one that had nothing to do with failing houses or shrinking communities. These were living structures that had learned to survive not by resisting the climate, but by accommodating it, bending when necessary and withdrawing their vulnerable parts away from the frozen ground. At night, he opened his notebook and tried to put into words what he had begun to understand. The memory of his grandfather came to him not as a voice, but as a persistent pressure behind his eyes. When he was young, his grandfather had described places in the southern states where homes were raised on wooden posts where people understood that the earth was not always a friend. Those stories had seemed distant at the time, a curiosity from another geography. But now they returned as fragments of a practical wisdom that had been lost in his own life. His grandfather had never spoken about insulation or heat transfer, yet he had known instinctively that a house that clung to damp soil would eventually rot from within. Driven by a need that felt closer to hunger than to curiosity, he began to study. The small library in the district center became his refuge during the afternoons when his hands were too stiff to work. He read books whose covers had faded into anonymity, manuals that no one had borrowed in years. He traced diagrams of wall assemblies and airflow patterns with his finger, trying to translate their abstract language into something that could be built with salvaged wood and stubbornness. What he found, repeated in different forms across decades of publication, was a simple truth that few people around him seemed to grasp. Heat did not only escape through roofs and windows. It was stolen by the ground itself, drawn downward through floors and foundations until the interior of a house became an extension of the frozen soil beneath it. This idea altered the way he saw every structure in the village. He noticed how snow melted fastest around the bases of the houses, not because they were warm, but because they were bleeding energy into the earth. He imagined the path of that heat, leaving the rooms where people huddled and sinking invisibly into the soil, never to return. No amount of firewood could change that fundamental relationship. As long as a house rested on the ground, it was engaged in a losing exchange with winter. From this realization, the outline of a solution began to form, tentative at first, then increasingly concrete. He sketched shapes that did not touch the bottom edge of the page, forms that floated above an implied surface. He rejected the idea of traditional stilts almost immediately. They would still require digging, still transmit cold through their narrow cores. What he needed was something that would place the living space entirely within a different thermal environment, suspended in air that could act as a barrier rather than a conduit. The trees he had been studying provided the missing piece. Their trunks were not merely vertical supports. They were insulated columns of living matter, their internal temperature regulated by processes far more efficient than any man-made system he could afford. He pressed his hand against one on a particularly cold morning and felt, beneath the chill of the bark, a faint suggestion of stored warmth. It was not heat in the comforting sense, but it was stability, a refusal to sink to the extremes imposed by the surrounding air. He imagined a structure woven into that stability, a room lifted away from the frozen soil and anchored to something that had already learned to survive. He spent days comparing possibilities. A house on the ground meant repeating the cycle of rot and collapse. A house on concrete piers would require money and tools he did not have. A house in a tree demanded only courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to be laughed at. It also promised something else, something he had not yet allowed himself to believe in. It promised that, for once, the cold might have to work to reach him, rather than being invited in through the floor. The technical reasoning that emerged from his reading gave him the confidence he needed. A small volume of air was easier to heat than a large one. A sealed envelope of insulation could trap warmth far more effectively than thick walls that leaked at every seam. An air gap beneath the floor, if shielded from direct wind, could act as a thermal break, slowing the flow of cold from below. None of this was revolutionary in isolation, but together they formed a system that addressed the specific failure he had witnessed in every house he had ever known. By the time he closed the final book and walked back through the village, he no longer felt the weight of other people's doubts. The idea was no longer madness to him. It was an answer shaped by loss, refined by study, and grounded in a clear understanding of what had destroyed his former life. The land he had bought was not a place to build in the conventional sense. It was a place to rise from, a starting point for a structure that would owe nothing to the frozen earth beneath it. By the time the idea had hardened into conviction, the forest no longer looked like a backdrop to his plans, but like their foundation. He no longer wandered among the trees as an observer. He moved with the careful intent of someone searching for a partner in a risky undertaking, measuring each trunk with his eyes, testing the soundness of bark and wood with the flat of his hand. He was not looking for beauty or symmetry. He was looking for endurance. The first days were spent in silent evaluation. He circled the largest conifers at the edge of his plot, noting how their roots bulged the soil outward, evidence of years spent gripping the earth against storms. He checked the direction of their lean, the scars left by fallen branches, the way their crowns shifted when the wind pressed against them. Most were rejected without ceremony. Some were too thin, others too twisted by years of exposure. A few had been hollowed by rot he could feel beneath the bark. He understood that his life would soon depend on a choice that could not be undone once made. Eventually, he settled on a pair of old larches that stood close enough together to share a burden. Their trunks rose almost parallel for several meters before diverging into separate crowns, and between them stretched a natural corridor of space that seemed, in a strange way, already reserved. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing but the muted hush of sap moving somewhere deep inside, a sound so faint it might have been imagined. Yet it was enough to convince him that these trees were still alive in a way his old houses had never been. Money was his next adversary. The notebook, filled with sketches, did not buy lumber or fasteners, and he owned no tools beyond a battered saw, a hammer with a loose handle, and a drill whose battery held a charge only grudgingly. He began to collect what others had abandoned. From the ruins of the former house site, he salvaged boards that had not yet turned to dust, trimming away rot until only clean wood remained. He drove to neighboring hamlets where barns were being dismantled and asked for scraps. Often he was refused. Sometimes he was ignored. Once in a while, someone would shrug and point him toward a pile of debris behind a collapsing shed. He carried everything back by hand or strapped to the roof of his truck, learning to judge weight not by how heavy it felt at the start, but by how it would feel after the fifth or sixth trip. His hands split and bled. The cold entered his joints and lingered. Yet, with every plank he stacked beneath the chosen trees, the idea took on physical form, transforming from lines on paper into a presence that could no longer be dismissed. The first true act of construction was the most frightening. He rigged a crude system of ropes and pulleys from old clothesline and scrap metal, anchoring one end to the trunk of the larger tree, and the other to a horizontal beam he had cut from a fallen log. He raised it inch by inch, pausing whenever the rope groaned or the beam shifted in an unexpected way. When it finally settled into place between the two trunks, held by clamps he had improvised from bent brackets, he stood back and stared at it as though it were a miracle. It was nothing more than a piece of wood suspended in the air, yet it represented a refusal to submit to the rules that had governed his life until now. The platform grew slowly. Each new beam was a negotiation with gravity, each joint a test of his understanding of force and balance. He learned to trust the trees not as static pillars, but as living supports that flexed and responded to weight. When the wind picked up, the structure moved with it, swaying gently rather than resisting. He realized that a rigid house would have been torn apart here, but this one was learning to breathe with its environment. The latter was the last element he allowed himself to think about, perhaps because it was the most visible sign of his departure from convention. He built it wide, with steps deep enough to hold a full foot and side rails thick enough to grip with frozen hands. He carved grooves into each rung so ice would have less chance to claim it. When he finally leaned it against the platform, connecting earth and air in a single uncertain gesture, he felt an unexpected surge of vulnerability. Anyone who passed could see it now. Anyone could decide that his work was an invitation to mockery. They did not disappoint. Children were the first to react, pointing and laughing, daring one another to climb the strange wooden spine that led nowhere they could understand. Adults followed with quieter amusement, shaking their heads as they passed, their expressions carrying the polite distance reserved for someone who had already been classified as harmlessly irrational. He heard fragments of their assessments when he went into the village for supplies. People wondered aloud how long it would take before he fell. Others predicted that the first heavy snow would send the whole thing crashing down. No one offered help. He learned to work in spite of this background noise, to focus on the precision of his own movements rather than the eyes that followed them. He reinforced the frame with diagonal braces that locked the beams together, spreading the load across both trees. He built the floor in layers, laying one course of boards, then a sheet of salvaged insulation, then another course turned at a different angle to prevent drafts. He moved methodically, checking each connection, climbing up and down the ladder so often that the rhythm of it became part of his body. Occasionally, he returned in the evening to find something amiss. A loose board where he was certain he had tightened every screw. A tool missing from its place. Footprints in the snow beneath the platform that were not his. He did not confront anyone. He simply repaired what had been undone and carried on, aware that his project had become a small disturbance in a place that preferred its disturbances to remain abstract. By the time the skeleton of the cabin was complete, standing between the trunks like a suspended cage, he was no longer the man who had arrived with nothing but an idea. He had begun to inhabit the space even before walls enclosed it, sitting on the bare platform in the evenings, watching the light filter through the branches. Below him the ground lay frozen and indifferent, a surface he would no longer be forced to negotiate with. Above him the wind whispered through needles and twigs, carrying with it a promise he could not yet articulate but already believed in. The cabin existed now as a skeletal promise suspended between two living pillars, but he understood that structure alone meant nothing against the kind of cold that had already destroyed his past. The real work was only beginning. He had lifted himself away from the ground, yet the air itself could still betray him if he allowed it to. The wind that threaded through the branches had a way of finding any weakness, any forgotten seam, and he knew from experience that a single gap was enough to undo months of effort. He began with the principle that had shaped his plans from the beginning. The smaller the space, the easier it was to protect. He resisted every instinct that urged him to build outward. There would be no spare room, no wasted corner. The cabin would be just large enough to hold a narrow bed, a compact stove, and shelves for the few possessions he still carried through life. He imagined the air inside as something precious, a limited resource that must be contained and reused rather than allowed to drift away. The walls rose in two layers, one embracing the outside world and one facing inward, each with a distinct purpose. The outer skin was rough, assembled from mismatched boards that he trimmed to fit as tightly as possible. It bore the marks of their former lives, nail holes, stains, traces of old paint, but together they formed a shield against rain and snow. Behind this layer he left a narrow cavity, filling it with everything that could trap stillness. He packed in dry sawdust he had collected from a shuttered mill, old wool blankets he had found in a thrift store, scraps of felt, even bundles of newspaper sealed in plastic to keep them from moisture. He pressed each handful into place until the cavity became a dense, muffled barrier. Only then did he add the inner wall, planed smooth with a borrowed sander, careful to eliminate any gaps. Between the two skins of the cabin, he was building not a thickness of wood, but a thickness of silence, a space where the movement of air would be slowed to the point of irrelevance. The process was painstaking. His fingers ached from pushing insulation into corners that did not want to receive it. His back protested the hours spent bent inside a structure that was already too small for comfort. Yet he welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him that this was a conscious act of resistance rather than another concession to circumstance. The floor was treated with the same severity. He layered boards until the platform beneath his feet felt solid, then covered them with insulating material before sealing everything under a final course of planks. He paid special attention to the points where the floor met the walls, knowing that these seams were often the hidden channels through which cold crept unnoticed. He sealed them with caulk and strips of fabric soaked in glue, building a continuous membrane that had no obvious point of failure. Above him, the ceiling became his obsession. He had learned from his reading that heat was impatient, always rising, always searching for the quickest route of escape. He refused to give it one. He doubled the thickness of insulation overhead, filling the space between the beams until his arms trembled from the effort. When he finished, the ceiling felt heavy, not in weight but in presence, a lid placed deliberately over the fragile warmth he intended to cultivate inside. He allowed himself only 2 small windows, set high on opposite walls so that light could enter without surrendering too much of the interior. He built frames within frames, a primitive form of double glazing that trapped air between layers of salvaged glass and clear plastic. At night, he covered them with thick curtains sewn from old coats, transforming each pane into a padded wall. The door received similar treatment, reinforced with layers of wood and fabric until it closed with a soft resistance that felt almost comforting. The stove was chosen with equal care. He rejected the large iron beast that had dominated his former houses, their hunger for fuel matched only by their inefficiency. This one was compact, designed for small spaces, its firebox just big enough to accept the split logs he could carry up the ladder. He positioned it so that its heat would rise naturally into the heart of the cabin, the flue threaded upward through a section of insulated piping that he shielded with metal to prevent fire. He tested the draft again and again, lighting small scraps of paper and watching how the smoke behaved, unwilling to trust a system that could fail silently in the night. Ventilation was the final challenge, the problem that balanced comfort against survival. He had read enough to know that a sealed space could become as dangerous as a freezing one. He carved narrow channels into the upper corners of the walls, fitting them with sliding panels that allowed him to control the exchange of air. He practiced opening and closing them in measured intervals, training himself to sense when the cabin needed to breathe. As autumn darkened toward winter, he turned his attention to preparation. He stacked firewood beneath the platform, sheltering it from snow with a tarp weighted by stones. He carried jugs of water up the ladder and stowed them in a corner where the heat from the stove would prevent them from freezing. He lined the shelves with canned food, bags of rice, dried beans, anything that could be cooked with minimal fuel. He laid out candles and a headlamp in case the battery-powered lantern failed, and assembled a small kit of tools and medicine that represented his last defense against misfortune. When the first true frost descended, he spent an entire night awake, testing the cabin as though it were a living creature he had brought into the world. He lit the stove and watched how quickly the air responded, how the chill that had followed him up the ladder receded from the walls. He pressed his hand against the floor and felt not the familiar numbness, but a muted warmth, proof that the barrier beneath him was doing its work. He moved from seam to seam, searching for drafts, sealing them as he found them, determined that nothing would be allowed to steal what he had fought so hard to create. By the time snow began to fall in earnest, the cabin had become more than a project. It had become a second skin, a layer of protection he carried with him not on his body, but around it. He no longer felt like a man merely surviving in a hostile place. For the first time in years, he sensed the possibility of stability, fragile as it was, held in place by wood, insulation, and an understanding of forces that had once seemed beyond his control. The cabin was finished in the sense that a body is finished when it can finally stand on its own. Everything that followed was refinement, the quiet, almost invisible work of living inside something that had not yet been tested by real winter. He moved into it gradually, first spending long afternoons there, then entire nights, and finally days without descending the ladder at all. From the ground, the structure still looked like a curiosity, a wooden box trapped between branches. But from inside it had already begun to feel like a place with its own pulse. The village did not adjust its opinion simply because he had closed the last seam or lit the stove for the first time. If anything, the laughter grew more confident as the cold deepened. He sensed it whenever he drove into town for supplies. Conversations halted when he entered the store, resumed behind his back in lowered tones. Children stared at his boots and gloves, which were always dusted with sawdust or ash, and whispered to one another. Adults were more restrained, but their restraint was a kind of indifference sharpened by expectation. They had seen people arrive with plans before. They had seen those plans collapse under the weight of weather and money. His tree-bound house was simply another story waiting to fail. He tried not to let it occupy his thoughts, but the solitude made that difficult. The cabin was too small to allow distraction. Every sound inside it was amplified, every movement measured against the narrowness of the space. When he cooked, the smell of food clung to the walls and ceiling. When he washed, the dampness lingered in the air despite his careful control of ventilation. At night, when the stove burned low and the wind threaded through the trees, the entire structure whispered in response, a chorus of tiny creaks and shifts that reminded him how precariously his life now hung. The first true cold nights arrived without warning. The temperature plunged so rapidly that the village radio announcer struggled to keep his voice steady as he recited the numbers. He climbed the ladder with a bundle of firewood under his arm and closed the door behind him, sealing himself inside the experiment he had constructed. The stove responded eagerly, the flame catching as though grateful for the attention. Within minutes, the air grew dense with warmth, a thickness he had not felt in any room since his childhood. Yet, comfort did not erase anxiety. He walked the perimeter of the cabin repeatedly, pressing his palm against the walls, the ceiling, the floor, searching for the faintest suggestion of a leak. Here and there, he felt a thread of chill, a place where the insulation had settled or the wood had shrunk. He marked these spots with pencil and returned to them with sealant and scraps of fabric, refusing to allow small failures to become large ones. The latter was his constant concern. Each morning, he descended it cautiously, testing the rungs for ice before committing his weight. He had carved grooves into them, but frost had a way of flattening every precaution. More than once, he found himself gripping the side rails with all the strength in his arms, suspended between earth and shelter, aware that a single mistake could send him crashing back into the world he had worked so hard to escape. The village followed his progress from a distance. They saw the smoke rising from the little chimney at odd hours, the light glowing through the curtained windows long after the rest of the settlement had gone dark. They shook their heads and went back to their own routines, secure in the belief that winter would correct his arrogance. He became a topic of casual conversation, a symbol of what happened when a man refused to accept the limits imposed on him by his surroundings. Inside the cabin, the days took on a disciplined rhythm. He woke before dawn to add wood to the stove, then sat on the narrow bed and watched his breath fade from the air as the room warmed. He cooked simple meals that required little fuel, ate slowly, listening to the forest settle around him. When he ventured outside, he did so with purpose, gathering more firewood, checking the tarp beneath the platform, scanning the trees for signs of stress. He treated the entire structure as a system that needed constant attention rather than a finished product. Doubt visited him in the evenings, when the work was done and the cabin was too quiet to distract him from his thoughts. He imagined the faces of the villagers, the way their mouths curved in private amusement. He wondered whether they might be right, whether he had traded one set of vulnerabilities for another that would soon reveal itself. The memory of the old house returned uninvited, its cracking walls and sinking floors replaying in his mind as though they were warnings rather than history. It was during one of these nights when the wind rattled the branches with a persistence that felt personal, that he sensed a change in the world beyond his walls. The cold was no longer episodic. It had settled in with intent, hardening the air until it carried sound in a way he had never noticed before. The forest creaked and sighed, not with the restlessness of autumn, but with the strained stillness of something under siege. He added more wood to the stove, checked the ventilation channels, and lay down without undressing, instinctively aware that whatever was coming would not announce itself politely. By morning, the village was wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like absence rather than quiet. He climbed down the ladder and stood on the frozen ground, listening. Even the birds had retreated. The cold had reached a depth that was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was structural, a force capable of reshaping the place he had come to know. He looked back at the cabin suspended above him, its walls catching the pale light, and felt the weight of everything he had invested in it. The laughter of the village faded in his memory, replaced by a more urgent question. Would the armor he had built be enough, or would this winter finally expose the limits of his defiance? The silence he had felt the morning before was only the opening note of something far more severe. By the time the next night arrived, the cold had gathered itself into a presence that no one in the village could ignore. The air itself seemed to harden, becoming brittle in the lungs, every breath an act that required attention. When he climbed into his cabin after dusk, carrying the last armful of firewood he could manage, the forest around him was already losing its softness. Snow that had once muffled the world now lay like a thin crust over a surface of ice, reflecting the moon with a pale, hostile glare. Inside, the cabin answered his arrival with a familiar warmth. The stove caught easily, the flame licking upward with a sound that had become as comforting to him as a heartbeat. He sat on the narrow bed and let the heat accumulate, feeling it fill the small volume of air he had fought so hard to enclose. Beneath him, the insulated floor resisted the pull of the frozen earth. For a moment, he allowed himself the rare luxury of believing that he had finally outpaced the climate that had ruled his life. Beyond the trees, the village was already beginning to fracture. He could hear distant sounds carried unnaturally far by the cold, the sharp report of wood splitting, the hollow thud of something collapsing under weight it was never meant to bear. The storm that had been predicted on the radio did not arrive in the form of blinding snow, but as a sustained assault of temperature, a plunge so sudden that the buildings had no time to adjust. Pipes froze in their walls. Radiators fell silent. Electric heaters groaned and failed. People woke in rooms that had lost all resemblance to the places they had gone to sleep in, their breath fogging the air as if they were outdoors. He remained awake through most of the night, not from fear, but from vigilance. He moved from wall to wall, checking the seams he had sealed weeks before, marveling at how little the cabin seemed to care about the violence unfolding around it. The air inside stayed stable, held in place by the layers of insulation that had turned this fragile box into a shell. When he placed his hand against the inner wall, he felt neither the shock of cold nor the dull numbness he had known in his former houses. There was only a muted coolness, the normal response of wood to winter rather than the aggressive chill of a structure being dismantled from below. As dawn crept into the forest, the world revealed itself in stages. The sky was an unbroken gray, the kind that seemed to erase distance. He descended the ladder slowly, every rung coated in a fine sheen of ice that resisted his boots. The village lay in a shallow bowl of white and shadow, its houses hunched like wounded animals. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. Windows were dark where they should have glowed with morning routines. The first sign of trouble came from the house nearest the store. Its roof had sagged inward under the combined weight of ice and structural fatigue, the wooden beams no longer able to hold the load they had been designed for decades earlier. Farther down the road, he saw a door stand open at a strange angle, the frame warped so badly that it could no longer close. From inside came the muffled echo of something breaking, a sound he recognized too well. It was the sound of a building given up. He returned to his cabin before the cold could settle too deeply into his clothes, closing the door behind him with a deliberate care that felt almost ceremonial. Inside, the contrast was immediate. The temperature wrapped around him, softening his hands, restoring sensation to fingers that had begun to ache. He sat for a moment and simply breathed, the difference between inside and outside so extreme that it bordered on the unreal. News traveled quickly even without working phones. He heard voices drifting through the trees, not close enough to make out words, but close enough to suggest movement, agitation, the restless circulation of people who no longer trusted the spaces they inhabited. The village was becoming a network of failures. One house lost heat and sent its occupants to a neighbor. That neighbor discovered that their own system was faltering and pushed outward in turn. The cold was not selective. It did not reward preparation or punish neglect. It exploited weakness wherever it found it. By midday, the road into town had become impassable, a corridor of packed ice that no vehicle dared to challenge. People moved on foot, bundled in layers that did nothing to protect them from the wind that scoured the open spaces between buildings. He watched them from the narrow window of his cabin, his view framed by curtains that he kept drawn except when he needed to check the state of the world beyond. He saw familiar figures pause beneath the trees, looking upward, their faces tilted toward the structure they had dismissed for months. The latter, once a symbol of absurdity, had become a line of possibility. The first to approach did so hesitantly, as though afraid that the cabin might vanish if acknowledged too directly. He recognized the shape of an elderly man who lived alone at the far end of the village, a figure who had always moved slowly even in good weather. The man stood at the base of the ladder for a long moment, gloved hand resting on the lowest rung, his posture heavy with a decision he had never imagined himself making. More followed, their footsteps crunching in the snow, their breath leaving visible traces in the air. From inside the cabin, he felt a tension build that had nothing to do with temperature. He had built this place as a refuge from the failures of the ground, not as a sanctuary for the entire village. The space was small, the resources finite. He thought of the wood stacked beneath the platform, the cans of food on the shelf, the narrow bed that barely accommodated his own body. Yet the sounds outside continued to gather, a low murmur punctuated by the scrape of boots against frozen earth. He opened the door at last, the warmth spilling outward in a rush that startled even him. The faces that looked up at him were not the ones he had known in the store or on the road. They were stripped of the casual expressions that had accompanied their laughter. Cold had made them urgent, their eyes reflecting a need that went beyond pride or habit. He did not speak. He did not need to. The ladder stood between them as both invitation and test, and one by one they began to climb, hands shaken not only from the temperature, but from the weight of what they were leaving behind. As the cabin filled, he adjusted instinctively, shifting objects, opening and closing the ventilation channels with a precision that surprised him. The heat held, rising and settling into the bodies that had been driven from their own homes. Outside, the village continued to break apart, its foundations betrayed by the very ground they trusted. Inside, suspended between two living trees, he felt the system he had imagined in solitude prove itself in the presence of others. The frost that had come to conquer the village had encountered something it had not been designed to defeat. By the time the cabin held more bodies than it had ever been meant to shelter, the storm outside had deepened into something that felt less like weather and more like a siege. The cold pressed against the walls with the stubborn persistence of an animal that refused to be driven away. Yet, inside the narrow room, the air remained astonishingly calm. Breath rose in pale clouds at first, then slowly faded as the heat redistributed itself among those who had climbed the ladder in desperation. He moved without thinking, making space where there had been none, clearing the shelves of his few belongings and pushing them into corners, creating places for people to sit on the floor or lean against the walls. The smell of damp coats and frozen wool mingled with the dry warmth of wood smoke, forming an atmosphere that was unfamiliar yet not unpleasant. These were the same people who had watched him with detached amusement for months, who had whispered their verdicts behind his back, and now they occupied the cabin as though it were the only room left in the world. He felt no triumph in this transformation, no surge of vindication. What he felt was something closer to gravity, the weight of responsibility settling over him as tangibly as the layers of insulation in the walls. Outside, the village continued to unravel. The sounds that reached them through the forest were fewer now, muted by snow and distance, but he imagined the scenes unfolding with painful clarity. Doors that could not be closed, stoves that refused to burn, water lines split open by expanding ice. Houses that had seemed immovable in their familiarity were proving to be temporary shelters at best. The cold had not merely entered them, it had claimed them, asserting its authority in a place where people had grown accustomed to believing in the permanence of things that were never designed to last. He adjusted the vents carefully, aware that the balance he had achieved could be lost if he treated the cabin like an ordinary room. Too little air and the smoke from the stove would thicken. Too much, and the warmth would bleed away into the branches. He had practiced this dance alone for weeks, learning the rhythms of his own creation, but now he had to apply that knowledge in a situation that had never appeared in his sketches. The system responded as though it had been waiting for this moment. The stove burned cleanly. The walls held their silence. The ceiling returned the rise in heat instead of surrendering it. Those who had climbed up first were already beginning to thaw. Their shoulders lowered, the tension in their faces easing as sensation returned to hands that had gone numb. Some sat with eyes closed, absorbing the fact of warmth as though it were a gift too precious to squander on conversation. Others remained standing, unwilling to trust the cabin with their full weight, glancing upward at the beams that held them suspended above a world that had just failed them. He found himself watching the ladder as much as anything else. It had been a symbol of isolation when he built it, a visible marker of his refusal to live as everyone else did. Now it was a conduit of survival, the narrow bridge between a collapsing village and a structure that had not yet learned to break. People climbed it cautiously at first, then with increasing urgency, as word spread that the little house in the trees was still warm. The shame he had expected to see in their movements was less pronounced than he had imagined. In its place was something more honest, a quiet acknowledgement that pride had no use in a moment like this. The storm reached its peak that night. The wind howled through the upper branches with a force that shook the cabin, the entire structure swaying in response. He felt the motion in his legs and spine, a reminder that he was no longer standing on solid ground, that he had tied his fate to two living trunks that were themselves enduring the same assault. Yet the movement was not violent. It was the measured response of something designed to bend rather than shatter. The people around him fell silent, instinctively recognizing that any noise they made would be swallowed by the roar outside. He remained awake long after the others had settled into a fragile sleep. He moved among them, checking that no one was too close to the stove. The coats and blankets were not blocking the vents, that the door was sealed as tightly as he could make it. His mind returned to the image of his former house, to the way its walls had cracked under the pressure of winter, the way the ground had reached up to claim it. The contrast was almost unbearable. This cabin, which had been assembled from scrap and stubbornness, was holding against a force that had destroyed structures built with far greater confidence. Morning came reluctantly, the gray light filtering through the curtained windows like an apology. The storm had not vanished, but it had lost its momentum, retreating into a bitter cold that no longer felt triumphant. When he opened the door, the forest revealed itself as a place newly rearranged. Branches lay scattered across the snow, some snapped clean, others twisted into unfamiliar shapes. In the village beyond, he could see the damage clearly for the first time. Roofs sagged where they should have been straight. Walls leaned at angles that suggested imminent collapse. The road was a scar of ice that no one would attempt to cross for days. The people began to descend the ladder in small groups, returning to the remnants of their homes with expressions that carried no trace of the laughter that had once followed him. They did not thank him in the way he might have expected. Gratitude was present, but it was quiet, unadorned, expressed in nods and brief glances rather than declarations. They moved with a different posture now, as though something in them had been realigned by the simple fact of having survived in a place they had dismissed. He stood alone again in the cabin once the last of them had gone, listening to the stove and the faint settling of the wood around him. The space felt emptier than it ever had, not because he was lonely, but because the silence had changed its quality. It was no longer the solitude of a man working in isolation. It was the stillness that follows an event large enough to redraw the boundaries of a community. In the days that followed, the village approached him with a new kind of attention. People brought what they could spare, a plank here, a box of nails there, gestures that were modest but sincere. They asked questions not about why he had built the cabin, but about how. He answered when he could, not as an expert, but as someone who had learned through necessity. He saw in their faces the same mixture of fear and curiosity that had driven him into the forest months earlier. When he climbed the ladder in the evenings now, he did so with a sense of continuity rather than defiance. The cabin remained small, imperfect, and precarious, yet it had proven itself in a way that no blueprint could have predicted. It stood not as a monument to ingenuity, but as a reminder that survival often begins with the courage to refuse the ground beneath one's feet. The house they had once laughed at had become something else entirely. Not a spectacle, but a testament to the possibility that even the most unpromising ideas can become shelters when the world decides to test them. If this story moved you even for a moment, don't let it end here. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next chapter and the other stories already waiting on this channel. More discoveries, more true-to-life survival stories, more moments that change everything are coming very soon. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one bold decision can rewrite an entire life.